They told you trains were built to carry progress, to carry hope, to carry people home. But what if one day, in the blistering silence of the Texas plains, a train arrived carrying nothing but death? What if the faces pressed against its windows were not the living, but the vacant eyes of passengers who had already crossed the threshold no one returns from? The air that day carried a stench no wind could scatter, a stench of iron, of heat, of bodies that should have been warm but were already cold. No conductor stepped down, no whistle blew in greeting. Only the grinding halt of steel on steel, and then a silence so heavy it felt forbidden to break it. Why was this train allowed to roll into a town with no living soul aboard? Who loaded its cargo, and why were witnesses ordered to keep quiet? The year was 1868, the place a Texas rail line carved from blood-soaked land, and the story you are about to hear was buried before it could spread. Buried, because the truth was not a tragedy of chance but a secret designed to vanish. And once you hear it, you'll never look at a passing train the same way again. The first sign that something was wrong did not come from the whistle of the train, for on that hot afternoon in 1868, the whistle never sounded. The people gathered at the small station on the edge of a Texas town had been waiting beneath a relentless sun, hats tilted low and handkerchiefs pressed against their necks, for the familiar cry that usually carried across the fields before iron wheels came into sight. But instead the train simply appeared at the far edge of the track, a shadow shimmering in the heat, gliding forward with a sluggish rhythm, as though it carried a burden heavier than it was meant to bear. At first, there was excitement. After years of war and ruin, the arrival of a train meant family returning, soldiers coming home, trade flowing once again into places that had nearly starved for lack of connection. Mothers straightened their dresses, children strained on their toes to glimpse the black cars, and old men leaned on their canes, remembering the first time they had seen the miracle of steam cut through dust and silence. But as the train grew closer, a strangeness settled over the crowd. The windows did not move. Faces could be seen behind the glass, yet they remained still, shadows frozen in place. A child pointed and laughed, thinking the passengers were asleep, but a rancher beside him muttered something low, crossing himself with a hand rough from work. The air seemed thicker as the machine groaned toward the platform, sparks hissing against metal wheels that screeched louder than usual, a grinding, reluctant sound that scraped against the nerves of everyone listening. Then it stopped. Not with the practiced grace of a crew guided by signal and hand, but with a sudden jarring lurch that made the cars shudder. Dust rose around the engine, swallowing the first few steps of those who dared approach. And it was only then, as silence fell, that the waiting families realized something was missing. No conductor called out. No porter stepped down to help unload trunks. No one emerged to greet the sea of expectant eyes. A woman in a faded bonnet climbed the steps to the nearest carriage, calling for her husband. She disappeared into the shadows of the car, her voice echoing inside, and then she screamed, a sound so sharp and unnatural that the entire platform froze. Her body stumbled back into daylight, hands trembling, face drained of all color, as she gasped for air that would not fill her lungs. Behind her, others rushed forward, some out of concern, others out of morbid curiosity. When they entered the car, the horror became undeniable. Passengers sat upright in their seats, but not one of them moved. Some leaned against the windows, with eyes open, pupils glazed and lifeless, staring into nothing. Others slumped as if in sleep, yet their skin was pale, lips cracked, breath absent. The car was filled with the smell of something sour, metallic, and final. At first there was disbelief. The station master insisted it must have been heat exhaustion, the kind of fainting that long journeys often caused. He urged people to fetch water, to fan the still forms, to give them time to rouse. But as more of the crowd pressed forward, the reality could not be denied. A child's small body was discovered locked in the stiff embrace of her mother, her tiny hand clutching a toy that now seemed grotesque in its innocence. A man's face bore scratches down to raw flesh, as though he had tried desperately to claw his way free. Others bore no wounds at all, only silence, as if death had crept in gently and stolen the breath from their lungs without a fight. The sheriff was called, though his steps were hesitant, and his eyes darted nervously to the sealed freight car near the rear of the train. When asked to open it, he shook his head and said the crates inside belonged to the railroad, marked with symbols that only military officials would understand. He warned the crowd to leave the cargo alone, to focus instead on tending to the dead, though his voice quivered with unease. And yet, it was not only death that unsettled the town. It was the manner of it, the stillness too perfect, the arrangement too precise, as if every man, woman, and child had died in unison, captured by the same unseen hand. Disease was whispered first, the cholera that had haunted camps and towns. Through the war had always been known to strike suddenly, leaving bodies in heaps. But cholera did not freeze people upright in their seats. It did not leave eyes open, fixed forever in silent warning. As the sun dipped lower, shadows stretched across the station, and the air grew heavier with the smell of decay. Families begged for explanations, demanded to know why no telegram had warned of sickness on the train, why no doctor was summoned before the cars rolled into their town. The station master offered no answers, only orders. The dead would be removed quickly, the train sealed and taken elsewhere. When pressed, he muttered that higher officials had already been notified, and that no questions should be asked until word arrived. But the people knew better. They had seen the truth in the silence of the cars, in the way officials avoided each other's eyes, in the sudden disappearance of records that should have been nailed to the depot wall. Something was being hidden, something darker than a simple outbreak or mechanical failure. That night, lanterns burned along the tracks as wagons carried the bodies away, though no prayers were read and no names were spoken aloud. Some of the corpses were unrecognizable, too withered by heat, or too distorted by whatever final terror had seized them. Others were quietly claimed by relatives, though their grief was accompanied by fear. Fear that they had witnessed something not meant for ordinary eyes. Rumors spread quickly, carried to saloons and whispered across fence lines. Some swore they had seen soldiers boarding the train days earlier, transporting secret cargo under armed watch. Others claimed the train had passed through an area known for strange sickness, where wells had been poisoned during the war to drive families from their land. A few even said the passengers had never boarded at all, that they were already dead when the train set out, loaded as part of some grim cover-up. The truth, whatever it was, remained sealed behind doors that the town was warned never to open. Yet the memory of that day could not be erased. The sound of the train's arrival without a living soul to announce it, the sight of frozen faces behind glass, the stench that seemed to cling to the air long after the cars rolled away. All of it became part of the town's haunted lore. And as the years passed, the story was spoken less in daylight and more in hushed tones after dark, with children warned not to wander near the old tracks. For the dead train had come once, and perhaps, as some believed, it might come again, carrying the silence of secrets that were never meant to leave the shadows. The morning after the train arrived, the town was not the same. What had once been a place of chatter and routine, where farmers unloaded produce and families shared news on the platform, had turned into a stage of suspicion and unease. The air itself seemed altered, as if the very dust carried whispers from the dead. Those who had stepped onto the train the day before, even for a moment, now looked pale and unsettled. Their voices quivered when they tried to describe what they had seen, and many broke off mid-sentence, their eyes darting toward shadows as if the memory itself was too heavy to hold in daylight. The first testimonies began quietly, in kitchens and barns, where neighbors gathered to make sense of what they had witnessed. A young man who worked as a porter confessed to his father that he had entered the second car, hoping to help passengers with their bags, only to find rows of rigid bodies staring back at him. He swore he heard a faint groan, though when he leaned close, the sound seemed to come not from a living throat but from the shifting timbers of the car itself. His father hushed him quickly, warning him never to repeat such words where officials might hear. Others gave their accounts in fragments. A shopkeeper's wife said she saw a boy's face at the window as the train pulled in, but she insisted his lips moved soundlessly, as though he were speaking from behind a glass coffin. An old rancher recalled the way the wheels screeched at the station, louder and longer than usual, and claimed it was not the sound of machinery but of souls unwilling to arrive at their final destination. Children who had peered too closely described eyes that seemed alive one moment and vacant the next, as if the passengers shifted between life and death in the flicker of the sun. The sheriff tried to gather these accounts formally, but every time he began, something stopped him. The station master would interrupt, reminding him that the railroad had already declared the cause an illness acquired en route. The town's physician, summoned reluctantly, insisted on keeping his distance, saying he was not permitted to perform examinations. When pressed, he muttered that the bodies had been removed under military direction, and that his role was simply to observe from afar. It was a strange admission for a man sworn to tend to the living and the dead alike, and it left the townspeople with more questions than answers. The most disturbing testimony came from the woman who had first screamed inside the carriage. She tried to explain what had made her voice tear through the air, but her words faltered. She said that when she entered, she found her husband seated upright, eyes staring at her but unseeing. His hand was clenched tight around the brim of his hat, as if in his last moment he had tried to hold on to something ordinary, something human. His mouth was slightly open, frozen mid-breath. She claimed she reached out to touch him, and though his skin was cold, there was moisture in his eyes, as though a tear had fallen after death. She fainted then, and when she awoke on the platform, others had already begun to drag the bodies away. Every testimony carried with it an unspoken question. How could an entire train of passengers die at once without a single cry for help reaching the towns along the line? Conductors usually stopped for water, for coal, for signals. At each point, someone should have noticed. Yet no warning had come, no telegram had been sent ahead. It was as if the train had been swallowed by silence until it emerged, full of corpses, in that small Texas town. Theories swirled like dust storms. Some swore it was an outbreak of plague, carried by rats hiding in the freight. Others whispered of poison slipped into canteens or food. A few suggested something darker still, that the passengers had been experimented upon, perhaps with new forms of gas or chemicals left behind from the war. The sight of sealed military crates at the rear of the train lent weight to these fears, and several men recalled the faint chemical stench that clung to their clothes long after they had left the platform. Yet when townsfolk tried to give their statements to officials from the railroad, they were dismissed. Their accounts were exaggerated, their memories distorted by grief and shock. The records written that day listed no names, only numbers. Entire families who had boarded the train were reduced to a tally, a line in a ledger that would never be open to the public. Those who pressed for answers found themselves visited by stern men in uniform, who warned them that continued talk would only invite trouble. The message was clear. Silence was safer than curiosity, but silence did not erase what had been seen. The townspeople remembered every detail in ways that could not be scrubbed from their minds. They remembered the eerie stillness of the train, the way no birds sang near the tracks that evening, as though nature itself recoiled. They remembered the flicker of lamplight on pale faces, the way children cried without fully knowing why, and the hollow sound the train made when it departed, as though it carried with it not just the dead, but the weight of something unspeakable. In time, those testimonies became part of the town's hidden lore. They were not written down, but they were told in secret, passed from one generation to the next as warnings. Do not trust the silence of a train, parents told their children. Do not look too long at the windows if the faces inside do not move. The words sounded like superstition, like ghost stories told to frighten the young. Yet those who had stood on the platform in 1868 knew they were not tales, but fragments of something buried too deep to reach daylight. Even decades later, when new lines replaced the old and trains became faster, the story remained. Old men at saloons would fall silent when the subject arose, their eyes clouding with the memory of that day. Widows would clutch faded photographs, whispering that their loved ones had not died on a battlefield or in sickness, but on a train that should never have been allowed to arrive. And somewhere in those whispers, in those reluctant testimonies, the truth lingered like smoke after a fire, faint, elusive, and dangerous to grasp. What united every account, no matter how scattered, was the same chilling certainty. The train had not brought life into the town that day. It had brought only a riddle carved in silence, one that no official would answer and no witness could ever forget. The town could not forget the look of the bodies, for the images carved themselves into memory with the weight of nightmares. What made the scene unbearable was not simply that the passengers were dead, but the contrast in the ways they appeared to have met their end. In the first carriage, there were those who looked almost serene, their heads tilted as though they had simply fallen asleep mid-journey. The soft folds of their clothing remained in order, hands resting peacefully in their laps. A man in his I-40 still clutched a folded newspaper, his thumb tucked neatly into the crease as though he had been reading when death slipped in, quiet as dusk. A young woman wore a faint smile, her face untouched by strain, her body poised in the dignity of rest. For a moment, to glance upon them was to be tricked into thinking they might yet stir. But further into the train, the truth grew more grotesque. Some passengers bore faces twisted in terror, mouths stretched open in eternal cries that had never been heard, eyes bulged wide, clouded but unblinking, capturing the last moment of panic like mirrors reflecting a horror invisible to the living. One man had gripped the armrest so violently that the wood splintered beneath his fingers. His knuckles remained frozen in that desperate clutch. A child lay across the aisle, her small body arched unnaturally, as though she had convulsed in pain before her limbs stiffened. Beside her, a woman's nails had left deep, bloody streaks along the fabric of the seat in front of her, claw marks that spoke of a frantic attempt to escape something she could not outrun. What unsettled witnesses? Most was the mixture of peace and torment side by side. If sickness had struck, why had some slipped away gently while others seemed to have been seized by sheer terror? Why had some faces carried tranquility, while others bore the imprint of their last screams? It was as though death had chosen different masks for each of them, and no one could explain why. The townsfolk whispered about it for weeks, replaying the images in their minds, unable to reconcile what they had seen. The physician, who was briefly permitted to examine a handful of bodies, noticed strange inconsistencies. He noted that the peaceful corpses had skin that remained cool but supple, as if they had died recently. The others, the ones locked in agony, were already stiffening, their muscles seized far sooner than expected, as though rigor mortis had struck unnaturally fast. He quietly suggested to the sheriff that it seemed unlikely they had all perished at the same time. There might have been intervals of hours, even a full day, between the first and the last. But such details never reached the public, for soon after, the physician was escorted away by men who bore the insignia of authority higher than the town could question. He did not speak of it again. Those who entered the train also recalled a peculiar sensation that clung to the air. In the peaceful sections, the air was heavy, tinged with an odor faintly sweet, almost medicinal. But in the cars where horror had frozen faces, the air stung the nostrils, acrid and sharp, the kind of smell that suggested burning chemicals or metal left too long in the sun. Survivors of war camps compared it to the stench of treated bandages and makeshift hospitals, though no one could place it exactly. Some believed the difference in air explained why some passengers went gently, while others fought for life until their final breath. Perhaps there had been gas, they said, something released in parts of the train but not in others. Yet if that were true, who had released it, and why? Among the corpses were further anomalies. Several passengers had marks on their wrists and ankles, faint bruises shaped like bindings, as if they had been restrained during the journey. A few bore cuts along their arms, thin and precise, as though made by instruments rather than accident. Others had clothing that did not match the season, coats too heavy for the Texas heat, garments that seemed issued rather than chosen. These details slipped quickly into rumor, for the sheriff insisted such talk was disrespectful to the dead, yet those who had seen the bodies whispered otherwise. The dead seemed not to be ordinary travelers at all, but people caught in something larger, something that did not belong to the rhythms of rail travel or family reunion. The greatest fear, unspoken by many but gnawing in private, was that what had killed them was not natural at all. Disease did not leave such precise differences. Accident did not create bruises shaped like shackles, and no explanation was given for the missing crew, the conductor, the porters, the engineers who should have been alive to guide the train. It was as though they had vanished altogether, leaving only their charges behind, arranged like grotesque mannequins of life cut short. At night, townspeople described dreams of those twisted faces, their cries echoing in silence, mouths open, wide but producing no sound. Some woke to the sensation of being watched, as though the dead had carried their terror into the realm of the living. Others claimed to see fleeting figures along the tracks, passengers in torn clothing drifting through the heat waves, never speaking, only staring with eyes that still bore the shock of their final moments. The horror of their expressions had imprinted itself not only on memory, but on the land itself. Yet despite all of this, the official account remained coldly simple. The passengers had succumbed to a sudden illness while traveling. No records of bruises, no mention of claw marks, no acknowledgement of the variance between peaceful death and violent struggle. To read the reports was to imagine an entirely different scene, orderly, tragic, but unremarkable. This dissonance between what people had witnessed and what they were told became a wound that never healed. For years afterward, when trains approached the town, there was always a moment of hesitation. Families waiting for arrivals would glance nervously at the windows, searching for any sign of movement, terrified of seeing faces still and lifeless once again. The memory of that day had created a scar that shaped how the town understood travel, death, and silence. It was not just the fact of the tragedy, but the cruel mystery of its details. Why some passengers had slipped away as if carried by sleep, while others had died in raw terror, clawing against an invisible fate. The mixture of calm and horror remained one of the central enigmas of the dead train. To some, it meant there had been an attempt to conceal the truth by arranging the bodies, to make the deaths appear natural to those who looked quickly. To others, it was evidence of something stranger, that whatever killed them was not uniform, but targeted, selective, leaving some untouched until the very end. And as time passed, the image of those frozen faces became a warning that death, when it came on rails, carried with it more than grief. It carried a secret the living were never meant to untangle. Theories spread across the town like wildfire, each one more unsettling than the last because no single explanation could account for what had been seen on that train. The most immediate and perhaps most convenient suggestion was disease. Texas in the years after the war was no stranger to outbreaks. Cholera, yellow fever, dysentery, all of them had cut down soldiers and civilians alike without warning. People remembered encampments where entire tents went silent overnight, where one man's cough spread like a brush fire until dozens were buried in shallow graves. So it was easy for the railroad officials to declare that the passengers had fallen victim to illness somewhere along the line, their lives stolen by an invisible hand. But those who had stepped onto the train knew that disease did not behave in such a tidy fashion. Sickness left chaos, not order. It left moaning, feverish bodies, not rows of silent corpses seated upright as though in some macabre theater. The second theory was whispered in saloons, where men spoke low over whiskey, glancing at the door before sharing what they had heard. Some said the passengers had been poisoned. They pointed to the strange chemical stench in the air, the unnatural way some of the bodies looked locked in agony, as though their lungs had burned from the inside. In an age where water was drawn from wells along the line, it was possible someone had tainted a stop with arsenic or some bitter extract left behind from military stores. Poison could account for the suddenness, for the simultaneous deaths, and perhaps even for the eerie mix of peace and torment. Yet this theory led to darker questions. Who would poison an entire train and for what purpose? Random malice seemed unlikely. Deliberate silencing seemed far more plausible. As these theories grew, another surfaced, one that was harder to dismiss, for it came from the men who swore they had seen freight crates bearing military marks in the rear cars. The Civil War had ended only 3 years before, but its ghosts were everywhere. Armories were filled with weapons and chemicals no longer in use. Experiments half completed, records scattered. Some believed the train had been used to transport such remnants, dangerous substances meant to be hidden or destroyed. If one of those crates had leaked, if something toxic had seeped into the air while the passengers sat unaware, It could explain why entire sections of the train seemed poisoned by a different atmosphere. But that led to a chilling possibility. If the authorities knew of this, why had they allowed ordinary people to ride in the same cars as military freight? Then came the most unsettling whispers of all, that it was not an accident, not disease, not even a leak, but something far more intentional. Old soldiers, bitter and broken, claimed the government had tested strange substances during the war, gases and compounds designed to incapacitate men without firing a bullet. The Confederacy had experimented, the Union had experimented, and, though few records survived, every veteran knew there were secrets that would never reach the public. Some believed this train was not merely transporting cargo, but subjects, unwilling ones. Passengers chosen at random, or perhaps already targeted, exposed to a substance as part of a hidden experiment. The peaceful faces, the twisted ones, the differences between carriages, all of it suggested a test, a comparison of effects. When the train arrived full of corpses, the officials who rushed to seal it off were not acting surprised, but prepared. For the townspeople, these theories carried unbearable weight, for each one painted them as witnesses to something forbidden. If it was disease, then why had there been no warnings, no quarantines, no doctors summoned to confirm it? If it was poison, then someone had walked free who had murdered dozens without consequence. If it was military cargo, then the town had been placed in danger by a decision far above their authority. And if it was an experiment, then they had seen the shadow of a cruelty they could never prove and never speak aloud without risk. Those who stood on the platform recalled other strange details that lent fuel to these suspicions. The train had arrived without whistle, without conductor, as though it were guided by unseen hands. Some swore they heard the hiss of escaping gas when the doors were first opened, a faint sigh that vanished quickly in the wind. Others claimed the bodies were too clean, too intact for natural death, as though they had been staged, placed to appear like passengers when in truth they had been carried aboard already lifeless. These were not the ravings of wild imaginations, but observations repeated by more than one witness, enough to make the silence of officials appear deliberate rather than accidental. In the weeks that followed, the authorities worked hard to stamp out speculation. Notices were posted in town, claiming the deaths were the result of contagion acquired during travel, and residents were instructed not to spread unverified accounts. Families were given the remains of their loved ones with strict instructions to bury them quickly, without autopsy, without gathering. Railroad workers who had helped remove the bodies were paid unusually well, but left town shortly after, never to return. It was as if someone was sweeping away the evidence, tidying the story into something digestible, something that would not trouble the wider public. Yet human memory cannot be buried as easily as bodies. Farmers who had touched the train described rashes on their hands that lingered for weeks, burns that felt chemical rather than infectious. Women who had washed the clothes of the dead reported water turning cloudy, sour-smelling, as though it carried something unnatural. These details, though never written down, kept alive the belief that something had been unleashed in that train that did not belong to nature. Years later, when the story resurfaced in hushed retellings, the theories had grown into legends. Some said the train carried Confederate prisoners who had been exposed to secret Union weapons, their deaths erased as if they had never lived. Others believed it was the opposite, captured Union soldiers hidden away, silenced so they would never speak of what they had endured. A few went further still, claiming the passengers had not been soldiers at all, but ordinary civilians chosen precisely because they were forgettable, because their deaths could vanish into history without anyone beyond their small town asking too many questions. The uncertainty itself became its own kind of haunting. Without answers, the mind filled in the void with shadows, and each theory, no matter how wild, carried enough fragments of truth to feel possible. The only thing everyone agreed upon was that the official story was a lie. Disease did not account for the bruises. Poison did not explain the missing crew. Accidents did not explain military crates. Something darker had happened, something crafted, concealed, and buried. And the people of that Texas town were left with the burden of knowing they had witnessed it, powerless to force the truth into the light. It was that very mixture, the silence of officials, the inconsistencies in the bodies, the forbidden smell that lingered in the cars, that ensured the story would never truly die. Each generation retold it not as history, but as warning. The train that came with the dead was more than a tragedy. It was a glimpse behind a curtain never meant to be lifted, and those who stood on that platform in 1868 carried the knowledge that sometimes when death comes, it is not by accident or fate, but by human hands determined to hide their own secrets. The whispers began before the bodies were even lowered into the earth. In a place like Texas in 1868, where rumor traveled faster than the locomotive that stitched towns together, people could not stop themselves from asking questions. How could a train pull into the station, its brakes squealing, its engine groaning, and yet not a single soul step out alive? Some said cholera, others said poison, and still others swore it was something darker, something the newspapers were forbidden to print. The official story shifted with every retelling, and yet none of it explained the smell that lingered over the tracks for days, or why entire logs of passenger names vanished from railway records overnight. In taverns and on porches, men swore. They saw officials burning papers by lantern light behind the depot, their shadows stretched long and distorted, like specters caught in the act of hiding something they could never confess. Women told of how the town doctor refused to speak of what he saw when he examined the bodies, muttering only that they were unnatural before drowning his silence in whiskey. The unease grew when survivors' relatives demanded answers. A mother from Galveston traveled hundreds of miles after receiving a letter promising her son would arrive on that train. She searched the station platform and the piles of bodies with frantic eyes, yet no one matched the face she longed for. When she demanded a passenger list, the station master, pale and sweating, told her there were none, not missing, not incomplete, none. The train, he said, had left no record at all. But how could that be? Every ticket sold, every name logged, railroads prided themselves on order and accountability. And yet here was a locomotive that carried dozens, maybe more, and no trace of who they were supposed to be. Whispers spread like a fever. Had the dead been prisoners, hidden away and moved under false pretenses? Were they immigrants, discarded because no one of status would come asking for them? Or worse still, had the train itself become something? Cursed, its cargo claimed by forces no human dared name aloud? Some in town spoke of a pattern. They recalled an older tragedy, hushed up along another line, where passengers disappeared into the prairie, their train never reaching its destination. Those who dug too deeply found their farms burned or their cattle poisoned, as though someone or something was determined to snuff out curiosity. The men who worked the railroads avoided eye contact whenever the death train was mentioned, their lips pressed tight, their eyes darting to the corners of the room, as if even speaking of it might summon punishment. A blacksmith swore that one night, while working late, he saw strangers loading heavy crates into the depot long after the train had been emptied of corpses. He described their movements as brisk, mechanical, without grief or hesitation, and he was certain the crates were carried off to be hidden. When he told others, he was warned to keep quiet, warned by men he had known his whole life, neighbors who suddenly spoke with the authority of threats that didn't feel like their own. The strangest detail came from a boy, no older than 10, who had crept close to the train before officials shooed him away. He swore the windows were not simply fogged or stained with grime, but streaked with something darker, something he thought was blood. He described hands pressed against the glass, as though passengers had tried to claw their way out before death took them. The townsfolk dismissed it as childish imagination, but the image rooted itself in their minds all the same, for it explained what so many felt but could not voice. These people had not died peacefully in their seats. They had struggled. They had known terror. And that begged the question, what horror had swept through a sealed train car on the Texas plains, and why was no one allowed to investigate? Over the weeks that followed, anyone who pushed too hard was silenced, sometimes subtly, sometimes with a force that left no room for doubt. A newspaperman who drafted an article calling the event "The Train of the Dead" was fired before the ink could dry. A preacher who spoke of it in his sermon, suggesting that sin had soaked into the very steel of the locomotive, was found beaten behind his church. And those who tried to trace the train's origin found themselves at dead ends, stations that, claimed they had never seen it. Conductors who refused to acknowledge its route. Logs scrubbed so clean, it was as if the train had never existed. The silence was worse than the whispers, for silence meant power was involved. Silence meant someone could erase truth itself. Meanwhile, the memory of that day never loosened its grip on those who stood on the platform when the train rolled in. They remembered the way the iron wheels slowed as if reluctant, the way the engine hissed like a living thing in pain. They remembered the oppressive heat that seeped from the sealed cars, as though whatever was inside had been cooking under a merciless sun. And when the doors were finally opened, they remembered the wave of odor, of stillness, of human forms slumped in eerie synchronicity, as though they had died together in one final collective moment. Each face was slack, each chest unmoving, and yet there was something uncanny about their expressions. Not fear, not suffering, but something that resembled surrender. The town tried to bury the bodies quickly, perhaps in hopes of burying the questions too. But the earth never truly covers secrets. Farmers swore the ground at the burial site refused to grow crops, as if it rejected what lay beneath. Travelers avoided the rail line, muttering prayers when passing by, and those who lived closest to the tracks claimed to hear, on still nights, the echo of a train whistle where no train ran, a long, mournful cry that seemed less like machinery and more like a warning. The mystery of the train remained unsolved, a scar in the history of the rails that connected Texas to the rest of the nation. But the silence surrounding it, so swift, so absolute, hinted that the truth was known by someone, somewhere. Perhaps it was officials who treated human lives as expendable freight. Perhaps it was men in suits who believed profit justified the sacrifice of the nameless. Or perhaps it was something older, something that dwelled in the land long before. Steel tracks cut across it. Whatever the cause, the outcome was the same. A train arrived one blistering day, and every passenger inside was already dead. And the world was told to look away, to forget, to move on. It began with contradictions, details that never aligned, accounts that shifted depending on who was asked. The officials insisted the train had been scheduled, its arrival expected, its path perfectly ordinary. Yet in the weeks after, men who swore they worked, the line claimed they had never seen such a locomotive listed on any roster, nor heard its whistle before that day. They spoke of its cars, painted in a drab gray unlike any they knew, their numbers rubbed away, their insignia gone. No manifest, no documents, no names attached to its steel. It was a machine without a past, a train stripped of its identity, as though it had been constructed for this journey alone. And still, those who were there on the platform said it pulled in heavy, its cars groaning as though laden with weight too much for its wheels. The more one listened, the stranger the story became. Survivors of nearby towns, those who claimed family had boarded days earlier, came forward in anguish, yet their testimony was treated as troublemaking. Their letters were confiscated, their cries dismissed, their grief explained away as delusion. A man from San Antonio said he had put his brother on a train headed north just 2 days before the tragedy. He described the exact features of the rail cars, narrow windows, reinforced doors, an unusual number of locks. He was certain it was the same train. But when he pressed officials, they denied that any such journey had been scheduled. If his brother had been aboard, they said, it must have been another line, another accident, nothing to do with this one. Yet the man was unrelenting, until one evening he was seen boarding a coach for home and was never seen again. It was then the theory began to grow that this was not an accident, not a tragedy at all, but a transport, a shipment, a movement of people that had gone terribly wrong, or had gone exactly as intended. Some whispered that prisoners were the cargo, men and women chained, moved in secret across the state. But if that were true, why erase their names? Why deny their existence? Others suggested it was immigrants, poor souls who had fled hardship, promised work on the railroads, then discarded when no longer useful. But no one could say why they had been sealed inside those cars, why the air had been shut off, why they had been left to suffocate under the relentless Texas sun. The simplest explanation was cruelty, but there were darker ones too. theories that turned the mind against itself. A rancher spoke of voices he claimed to hear when he passed the burial site, a low hum like chanting rising from the earth. He said it made the hairs on his neck stand tall, and that once, while tending his cattle nearby, he found the herd clustered and trembling, their eyes fixed on the mound of fresh soil where the bodies had been laid. The preacher, the same one beaten for speaking too boldly, hinted in confidence that the dead had not only suffocated. He said some of their faces bore marks he could not explain, contortions too unnatural for ordinary death. He would not call it possession. But his silence afterward was louder than any sermon. The blacksmith who had seen crates carried off insisted they contained more than papers. He described the sound of something shifting inside, like bones sliding, like weight shifting unevenly as though not entirely lifeless. He tried to tell others, but men from the rail company came to his shop, closed the doors, and when he emerged, his story had changed. He now said he had seen nothing at all. His hands trembled after that, and his hammer never struck as steady again. All the while the train itself became legend. Some claimed it was dismantled, its parts scattered so it could never again be recognized. Others believed it still rolled through the night, its whistle hollow, its lights glowing pale across the plains. More than one traveler swore they had seen it. A ghost train, its windows lined with faces that did not move, staring blankly out into the dark. Horses reared at its approach, dogs howled as though mourning, and always it passed in silence, vanishing into stretches of track that led nowhere. But perhaps the most disturbing accounts were those of men who tried to trace its origin. One investigator, a former soldier familiar with the logistics of transport, followed rumors to an abandoned siding deep in the scrublands. There he found evidence of loading, discarded ropes, broken chains, scraps of cloth caught in the weeds. He returned to town shaken, muttering that he had seen enough to know the truth, but before he could write his account, he too disappeared. His notes, kept in a small leather folio, surfaced years later in an attic. They were brief, fragmented, and almost unreadable, but one line stood out, scrawled in haste. Not an accident. Cargo was people, not meant to arrive alive. The words chilled those who read them, for they confirmed the darkest suspicion, that the train had not failed but had succeeded. The dead were not victims of misfortune, but sacrifices to a system that saw them as nothing more than freight. Whether for labor, for experiments whispered of in hushed tones, or for something that no living man dared articulate, the result was the same. They were meant to vanish, faceless, nameless, forgotten. Even decades later, the story lingered. Children dared each other to walk the tracks where the train had rolled in, claiming to hear footsteps behind them, to feel the brush of cold hands at their necks. Old-timers swore the ground near the depot stayed warm at night, as though it remembered the heat of those sealed cars. And in the archives of certain families, descendants of railway men who had lived through that time, there were letters, brittle with age, that spoke of orders from above. Orders to clear the records, to remove the evidence, to let the land swallow what it must. The handwriting shook as though even the act of recording the truth was forbidden, a crime against silence itself. Thus, the legend of the train that arrived with its passengers already dead became more than just a tale of tragedy. It became a warning. A shadow cast across the progress of steel and steam, reminding anyone who cared to listen that not every track laid across the earth was built for the living. Some carried death itself, disguised as transport, hidden behind schedules and timetables that never existed. And those who knew too much, who dared to lift the veil, were erased alongside the nameless souls who had once pressed their last breaths against glass, watching a world that would never know their names. There was something about the silence that unsettled even the strongest men. Silence in Texas was not unusual. On the open plains it was common for whole hours to pass with only the wind for company. But the silence that hung over the station after the death train's arrival was of a different nature. It was not absence of sound, but a weight, a suppression, like something pressing down on the chest of the town itself. Men who normally bragged at the saloon grew quiet when the subject was raised. Women who kept diaries skipped those days, leaving only blank pages where memories should have been recorded. Even the children, who usually took delight in exaggerating tales, seemed to avoid speaking of what they had seen. Silence became the only language spoken, and yet it spoke volumes. Those who did break the silence did so in fragments. A farmer recalled how he had seen birds scatter as the train approached, an entire flock of crows taking to the air as if fleeing from something unseen. A schoolteacher confessed that she had smelled the train before she ever saw it, the sharp tang of rot carried on the wind. Others spoke of how their animals grew restless. Horses reared, dogs whined, even cattle clustered close as though instinct told them something was amiss. It was as if the natural world recognized what the human mind could not yet grasp, that the machine rolling across the land was not of the living, but of the dead. Yet as days turned into weeks, the silence became more deliberate. The railway officials who had first responded grew scarce, their presence replaced by stern-faced strangers with polished boots and eyes that missed nothing. These men carried no insignia, wore no badges, yet their authority was unquestioned. They demanded records, seized documents, and spoke with the kind of finality that left no room for questions. Witnesses who had been willing to talk suddenly fell mute. A ranch hand who had sworn he would never be intimidated was later found, unconscious, his jaw broken, a warning carved into the dirt beside him with the butt of a boot. Forget. That word became a curse among the townsfolk. Forget. Forget what you saw. Forget who you lost. Forget what the air smelled like when the train doors swung open. Forget the way the faces looked inside. Eyes glazed, mouths parted, skin pale with the unmistakable imprint of death. The order was not merely to remain silent, but to erase, to pretend it had never happened at all. And the more the town tried to bury the truth, the more it festered. There were those who resisted. A preacher, despite his beating, returned to the pulpit weeks later and dared to describe the event as divine punishment. He said God had allowed the train to arrive to expose a sin too great to be hidden, that those who ignored it would be cursed. His congregation listened in fear, and, for a brief moment, his words gave them a language for their dread. But days later, his church burned to the ground. The fire was blamed on lightning, though no storm had passed through in weeks. He left town soon after, and with him went the last voice willing to speak openly. But memory has a way of leaking, through cracks. Children, unburdened by fear of authority, whispered to each other about what they saw. They played games, daring each other to mimic the dead faces, to press their hands against windows and pretend they were trapped inside. There, parents scolded them harshly, not out of cruelty but out of terror, for to repeat the images was to keep them alive. And still, the children could not help themselves, for the vision of that train was imprinted on them as surely as nightmares carved into the mind. Among the few relics of the incident were journals kept by the townsfolk. Most were vague, coded, or written with hesitations that revealed more than the words themselves. One woman wrote of how her dreams were filled with the sound of the train's whistle, though no whistle had blown when it arrived. Another man scribbled that he could not close his eyes without seeing hands clawing at glass. These entries were not meant for publication, not meant for testimony, but they survived in trunks and attics, passed quietly through generations. They revealed that despite the forced silence, the memory could not be extinguished. It lived on, like embers beneath ash, waiting for the right wind to stir it back into flame. The greatest mystery was the train's origin. Railways in that year were still expanding, still fragile, their records usually meticulous. Yet when investigators decades later combed through the archives, they found no trace of the death train's route. No purchase orders for coal, no telegraphs, alerting stations of its passage, no invoices for tickets. It was as though the train had been summoned out of nothing, made to appear only to deliver its cargo of corpses before vanishing into the folds of silence. The machinery itself left little trace. Some whispered it had been dismantled, its steel melted down, its wheels sold to other engines. Others insisted it still ran in secret, shifted from line to line, a phantom among the rails. The burial ground became another wound. Hastily dug, shallow and unmarked, it sat on the edge of town like an accusation. Crops would not grow there, Animals refused to graze near it, and travelers claimed to feel unease passing by. Some nights, locals said, you could see a strange glow above it, as though the earth itself was restless. Children dared each other to run across it at midnight, but none lasted long before fleeing in terror, claiming they felt hands clutching at their ankles from beneath the soil. These tales might have been dismissed as superstition, yet they carried a weight of sincerity, as though born from something felt rather than imagined. The longer the silence endured, the more the story transformed. It passed from memory into legend, from tragedy into myth. Some believed the dead had been victims of a plague, moved in secrecy to prevent panic. Others thought they were part of an experiment, human lives used as fodder for purposes too dark to name. And then there were those who insisted the train was not of earthly design at all, that it had crossed from some other realm, carrying souls who had never belonged to this world in the first place. Each theory grew darker, each whisper heavier, until the truth was no longer about facts but about fear itself. By the time decades had passed, the silence had achieved what it was meant to: erasure. The official histories made no mention of the death train. Railway records flowed seamlessly from one year to the next, as if nothing had interrupted their progress. But in the hidden corners, in the attics and journals, in the trembling voices of the few who lived long enough to remember, the story endured. It was not something they could speak in daylight, not something they dared teach their children, but it existed nonetheless. It existed as a shadow across the town's legacy, a whisper carried on the wind that swept across the tracks, a warning in the silence of the plains. For the dead had arrived on that train, and the living had been told to forget. But the land remembered, the air remembered, and deep down, so did the people, no matter how hard they tried to silence themselves. If you've stayed with me through this story, you already know. This isn't just history. This is the kind of hidden truth that was never meant to reach your ears, the kind of secret that forces you to question what else has been buried. Stories like the train that arrived full of the dead are erased from official records for a reason, because if too many people knew, if too many people started asking questions, the silence would shatter, and when silence breaks, power trembles. That's why I bring you these forbidden histories, the shadows that ordinary textbooks will never touch. But here's the truth. Keeping these stories alive depends on you. If you felt that unease in your chest, if the images of that train and its passengers still linger in your mind, then you've already become part of this search for truth. And I want to hear from you. Do you think this was a cover-up? A tragedy rewritten as nothing? Or something even darker? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one, and the theories you share often lead us deeper into the next mystery. And if you don't want these stories to vanish again, then hit subscribe right now. Join the community that refuses to forget, that refuses to let silence win. Turn on notifications so you never miss the next piece of history they tried to bury. Because the further we dig, the more we realize. Some trains never stop running, and some secrets never stay buried.